The Second World War began because vulnerable, resource-starved nations tried to use violent, mechanized shortcuts to achieve economic self-sufficiency. Ultimately, they were destroyed by the exact industrial scale they tried to bypass. Looking back at the period between 1939 and 1941, it is easy to assume the Axis forces possessed an unbeatable military machine. They rapidly defeated a coalition of enemies who possessed far more wealth and raw materials. But we have to look closely at the actual troop data to see how. This table details the opposing forces during the Battle of France. Notice the total manpower and tank rows. The German military committed roughly 2.7 million men and 2,700 tanks. The Allies matched them almost identically. These early results suggest that superior movement and coordination can overcome a raw deficit in resources. In a short conflict, battlefield execution can indeed be the deciding factor. Long-term victory requires a completely different set of metrics. When conflicts stretch beyond a few months, battlefield maneuvers matter less than gross domestic product, baseline national development, and industrial logistics. This is the brutal math of total war. You cannot simply send an army to fight. You have to mobilize your entire civilian economy, factories, farms, and infrastructure, to keep that army supplied with steel, oil, and calories. When a nation attempts this level of mobilization but fails to sustain it, the domestic economy breaks down entirely. The state cannot feed its people or rebuild its infrastructure, leaving the physical core of the country in ruins. Military brilliance is a short-term loan. Economic gravity is the final, unavoidable bill. We can quantify this gravity by looking at the baseline data from 1938, right before the war broke out. This chart shows the initial balance of power. The Allies, including their colonial empires, commanded over $1 trillion in GDP and a population approaching 700 million. The Axis powers controlled $751 billion in GDP and roughly 258 million people. That translates to a 2.7 to 1 Allied advantage in population and a 1.4 to 1 advantage in overall economic output. To bypass these mathematical disadvantages, the Axis powers initiated rapid, early conflicts designed to force a quick decision. They utilized blitzkrieg tactics to secure resources before the massive Allied economies could finish mobilizing. The trade-off was severe. By expanding aggressively, the Axis bypassed the immediate Allied mobilization, but guaranteed the resulting war would be fought across multiple, distant fronts. Those early tactical choices locked Germany and Japan into a prolonged war of attrition. They lacked the domestic wealth and natural resources to survive that kind of timeline. By 1942, the Axis empires reached their maximum physical extent. From a strategic perspective, this looked like overwhelming success. If we adjust our chart to reflect the territories they occupied, the Axis bloc absorbed hundreds of millions of people. On paper, their total controlled GDP nearly matched the Allies. But taking land is not the same as extracting wealth. The regions the Axis occupied in Eastern Europe and Asia were overwhelmingly poor, agrarian economies. To maintain control over these vast, rebellious territories, the Axis had to commit immense military manpower to act as an occupying police force. Physical expansion drained their troops without providing a sustainable industrial return on investment. To understand why occupied territory didn't save the Axis, we have to look at development level. This is a measure of a nation's baseline peacetime wealth, its administrative infrastructure, and how diverse its resources are. A highly developed nation, like the UK or the US, has the commercial infrastructure to divert over 40% of its economy to war production. They can efficiently ration food, source global fuel, and systematically shift labor into munitions factories without collapsing their domestic society. Low-income nations do not have that structural cushion. When a poor economy tries to mobilize for total war, it breaks its own supply chains. The more industry focuses on building weapons, the fewer goods are left to trade for basic imports. The result is severe food shortages, rationing failures, and administrative paralysis. Raw population size cannot compensate for a low development muggle. Without existing wealth and infrastructure, extreme mobilization destroys a state from the inside. Because they lacked raw materials, the Axis tried to engineer their way out of the deficit. They relied on highly specialized, complex designs, pouring resources into individual weapons with superior combat capabilities. The Allies took the exact opposite approach. They embraced mass production, de-skilling their labor force to churn out a limited assortment of standardized, interchangeable parts at a massive scale. This chart of ground and air munitions reveals the physical scale of that decision. Look at the divergence during the critical years of 1943 to 1944. Allied factories produced nearly 200,000 combat aircraft. In tank production, they established a relentless 5-to-1 advantage over the Axis. The Allies accepted that their individual tanks or planes might be qualitatively inferior in a one-on-one fight. They made the calculated choice to drown the enemy in replaceable volume. We can visualize how these strategies compete by mapping them. We'll plot combat impact against economic sustainability over time. The Axis doctrine starts with high combat impact, but because it relies on complex engineering and ignores deficits, it rapidly degrades as the timeline stretches. The Allied doctrine starts with lower individual impact, but backed by standardized production and a high development level, it scales upward into maximum sustainable volume. This intersection represents the moment when the sustainability of the Allied model overtakes the initial impact of the Axis military. Military supremacy is a fragile tool. When forced into a war of attrition against an opponent with a superior economic engine, early victories are slowly erased by math. Evaluating a conflict through a tactical lens is only useful for localized battles and short-term skirmishes. To accurately analyze prolonged global conflicts, you have to look at the unglamorous data: GDP per capita, fuel synthesis, and continuous industrial output. Victory ultimately rests on a nation's capacity to absorb mistakes and replace catastrophic losses. To understand how wars are actually won, discard the myth of the invincible warrior. Total war is won by the system that weaponizes its economy without breaking itself.